Welcome to Insight, a series exploring the deeper philosophies of renowned traditional martial artists, hosted by Ray Hughes, a martial artist with 50 years of experience.
Hey, welcome to the show. Today's show is part two of a two-part conversation with Sensei Gary Tsutsui. In this show, he'll discuss his move back to Colorado, starting his new school, talk a little about a bad accident that he had, and also give his overviews of the state of traditional karate as he sees it or feels it, and also competition. He also wanted me to correct a timeline issue from part one, and that was that it was 1994 that the USOC granted the national governing body to the USNKF. So you want to make sure that was clear. So with that, today, Gary Tsutsui. Well, Sensei, I want to do a recap of our part one conversation. That was you started at 18 years old. In 1965, you joined Yaguchi's organization and trained under him and other instructors for 6 years. Then you moved to California and you joined Yamazaki Sensei's organization. And it was during that time that you competed and medaled at the 1977 Muko Championships. Actually, the question I want to ask you before we move back into Colorado was that transition from one organization to the other organization, was that smooth? Was it easy? Was it difficult?
Let me backtrack just a bit. You mentioned that I trained with Yaguchi Sensei for 6 years. I actually trained with him for less than 1 year. And what
Yes.
happened was, at that time, he got called to Los Angeles to cover for Nishiyama Sensei, who had been recalled back to
Right.
Japan. I was living here in Denver. Yaguchi Sensei was, at that point, living in Los Angeles. And then we kind of crossed paths again when I moved to California in around 1970, 71, I believe. And then I continued the relationship with Yaguchi Sensei by every time coming back to Denver during the summer months, I would go to the dojo and train with him. So that's how that relationship was sustained over the years. And of course, when I moved back to Denver here, I was independent, but I still continued a relationship with him and from time to time train with him. And to answer your question, whether it was difficult or not, the only difficulty I really had was I had a really solid foundation with Kihon basics
Right.
because of the instructors that I continued to train with on a regular basis after Yaguchi Sensei had left Denver. So in particular, I trained with Joseph Castillo, Sensei Joseph Castillo, who was also JKA trained and also a graduate of the instructor school from Tokyo, in Tokyo, Japan, when he was stationed there during the military. And the joke in the dojo was that, if someone said, well, what did you do in class last night? Everybody would just say, well, let's say, was it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday? Because this is what we've been doing every single night, any of those days that you pick out for the last how many years they've been training. So there was very little variation. And every once in a while, he'd turn in a special class and we'd cover bunkai or self-defense techniques or sport karate, that kind of thing. So I had a really solid foundation in Kihon. What I was really lacking in was I didn't have the variety of technical skill with regard to kata when I went out to California, because when I transitioned from Denver to California at that time, I had only attained, I believe it was a green belt. And I started training with Yamazaki Sensei, of course, in California. And what I found out was all these other green belts and the green belts, the purple belts, blue belts, brown belts, they had this expansive repertoire of kata that they were doing and competing, because at that time, it was pretty close to every weekend. You could go to a different tournament from different style, and it was all open circuit. WKF had not been established yet. So I was really lacking with regard to that, and also with just free sparring. I was a little bit behind because my whole training was Ippon Kumite but the Kihon level. So I had to really catch up then. And then what I did was because my basics were so solid, I advanced pretty quickly under Yamazaki Sensei. And I actually attained my first Shodan in, I think, a couple of years after being affiliated with the JKF. And JKF was at that time Japan Karate Federation. And it was under Fumio Demura, Yamazaki Sensei, and also Dan Ivan. So that's how that training worked. And then it was a really funny thing because we would get visitors from time to time from Japan, and it was really comforting to me because these guys would come over from Japan and they were Shodan and higher, but These guys, they knew very little kata. Their kata was maybe they would learn one or two kata. So, the Shodan would come over, he'd know Hankudai and then Basaidai at the most. And you had a Nidan come over, and then he also knew Jion and maybe one other kata. So the training was I was kind of in a time warp there because my training reflected very closely to the training that those guys were going through at the time. So it's really interesting how that worked out.
Did, being Japanese American, were you treated any differently from the Japanese, good or bad?
I don't think so, but it's very difficult to tell because there's so many subtleties in any culture, and if
Right.
you're not an active participant in it on a day-to-day basis, hour by hour, minute by minute, it's difficult to tell sometimes. The Japanese have a saying, and I can't remember the exact wording for in Japanese, but they have a saying called reading the wind. So without any spoken word, without any expression on the person you're conversing with, their facial expression or any of that, one is expected to anticipate as well as perceive what's going on with the unspoken word. So that part for me was not difficult to adjust to. And I think part of that is because I grew up in a very Japanese culture oriented family. My family was three generations. For a while, we lived with my grandparents, and then, of course, my parents, and then me. And then there were 13 grandchildren in our family. But I was the firstborn grandchild in the Tsutsui family. So I was treated like royalty. I just got my way. I was spoiled rotten. My grandmother ran a restaurant after the war here in Denver for a number of years. And it was a Teuchi Udon restaurant, which is a handmade noodle restaurant that she took over. And she was very successful. And it was close to the elementary school that I went to. And I started walking to and from school when I was in second and third grade. But before I would leave the house, she would give me a menu to the restaurant that she was running and say, Gary, what would you like for lunch today? And I would just go down to the menu and I'd select whatever I wanted. And lunchtime, I'd leave the school and go to the restaurant, and there it is. It's all out for me. And, my grandmother would say, have a nice lunch. I'd have lunch and I'd go back to school.
Did you speak Japanese then and now?
I was bilingual pretty much until, well, I would say I started losing it right around seventh, eighth grade, because of course, on you know, our, a long time in public school, and of course, speaking English all the time. And then when I was 12 years old, my mother was a single parent. And so in our family, it was me as the eldest one, and I was 12 years old at the time. And my brother was 10 years old. We moved into an apartment. And then that created some distance between my grandparents and me, but I would still keep in contact with them and see them all the time. And then when I got involved in the karate, it kind of renewed my interest in it again. So I've always been able to at least function to some degree in a setting where only Japanese is spoken. And I traveled, the first time I went to Japan, I actually traveled alone and I separated from the group I was in Tokyo. And I was on my own for, I think it was 3 or 4 days where I traveled by myself. I went down to Kagoshima to do ohakamairi, which is attending to my grandfather's grave and paying respect to my grandfather. And I did that on my own, so I had to be able to function and get through the airports and all that kind of stuff. So, and I still understand a good amount, but conversationally, it's I just I don't feel real comfortable with it.
I studied Japanese for 7 years at the Arizona State University. I could never get the conversation. Oh my God, And then every time I would go up to Osaka Sensei and train up there, and we'd go out and drink sake, then I tried to speak Japanese to him and made him absolutely crazy, telling me to shut up, Ray.
Well,
But
it's a funny thing because you're based in Phoenix, and then Chuck Cover,
oh,
of
very
course,
much, very close
and he
friends.
trained with Koyama Sensei, and I can remember. Well, Chuck and I got to be friends because we both went to the U.S. training camp where it was the team selection for the World Championships that I competed at, and Chuck. I think it was in that visit or a subsequent visit, he told me, yeah, I love training with Koyama Sensei, but I just wish he would be able to speak a few more words of English. instead of just good morning, good night kind of thing.
A question I wanted to ask you, because I had talked to Holbush and Marlon about that when you started, that was during the Vietnam War era, right?
Yeah, it was. It was.
How did that have any influence on you one way or the other?
Uh, it did, and in fact, at that time, do you remember the lottery system?
Yes, absolutely. I had to
Yeah,
take that.
I
Yeah.
had a number that was actually called into service, and I actually went through the physical process, and
Really?
yeah, the number got called up, and then I was rejected. So on
Why? Because
medical
you're
grounds.
Japanese? Or you
I don't know. I think I just may have been a little bit. I don't know what I said to them. I was opposed to the war. I didn't
Mm.
think it was a just war, and it must have been something I said in the psychiatric interview that said, "Well, I'm not suited for military service." So I can't remember what the designation was, but I got exempt from doing that. And what I ended up doing was I went to business school. There used to be a school here in Denver called Barnes School of Business, and dabbled a little bit in that, and then actually started computer programming. And then back at that time, it was Fortran and some other beginning languages and stuff. And eventually, from there, was accepted back into the university because the first year that I graduated from school, my grades were not really good, but I was able to at least get a high enough score on the SATs where the school was forced into a position of offering me a joint honor scholarship, which paid for tuition and books. And I was actually discouraged from accepting it by the college counselor. And he was right. I wasn't ready for college. I ended up getting bad grades, lost the scholarship, got subjected to the draft, had to go through that whole process,
Yeah.
high pressure process and everything. So I was on academic suspension for 1 year. And then I went back and then learned my lesson, started pulling all A's and stuff like that. And let me tell you, and I'll tell any of your listeners, the younger ones, don't flunk any classes because it just takes forever to convert that and start approaching a 4.0 average. You get just one fail. It's really tough. You got to take a lot of hours to convert that. And then
Yeah, that's a good
yeah,
point.
one thing that period in the 60s, I think it was just a really dangerous period for one thing. And then the Vietnam War thing, played such an active and persistent part in our lives. And one thing I could not understand, even though any person was might have been opposed to the actions of the United States or anybody in the war and stuff like that, I could not believe the ill treatment the veterans were getting coming back to the States. I mean, well, I couldn't support that kind of thing.
Very, very dark time. Very, very dark
Yeah.
time. Well, I wanted to ask you, so at some point, you decide to move back to Colorado. What caused you to move back to Colorado?
Well, that year of the World Championships was 1977, December. So, of course, we're talking in December. Then the year starts, 1978. And then I kind of went into a slump when there's just the intensity of the training and then
Mm.
competition, all that stuff. It just really took its toll on me. So I was pretty much non-functional for about 3 months there, and then started being active again. But during the time of prior to the World Championships and during the World Championships, I was married. I was married for 12 years the first time, and the relationship, I just didn't pay enough attention to the relationship and ended up getting separated at the end of 1978. So the fall of 78, well, here's where I'm not sure, is either the tail end of 77 or in the fall of 78 that I decided to go back to Denver. And at that time, my stepfather had died as well. And I was the eldest in the family. So it was a good excuse for me to go back, take care of business for the family, and then start off again. And then my wife at the time decided that that was just not in her schedule. So I ended up coming back to Denver, not training at that time. So I had a short period where I was not training. Ended up going into business with my soon to be ex father in law. So I couldn't find any work coming to Denver. And he was a very successful entrepreneur that had a share of 3 or 4 retail drugstores in Denver. So I just went up there and said, hey, I really need a job. I don't care, you know, manual labor or whatever. I just need a job. So I ended up cashiering for him and gradually took on more and more responsibility. And then after about 3 months, 6 months, he asked me to if I was interested in becoming a full-time partner in the business. And I told him, I'd be honored to do that, but I have to let you know I'm going to divorce your daughter. And, and then he said, "Okay, what do you think? You want to be a partner?" So that was a great opportunity. So I ended up becoming a shareholder with the real estate as well as the business that was on the real estate that we owned as well with the partnership.
Well, during that time, you're not training, and I know you have an accident you're gonna talk about in a few minutes. Were you training prior to this accident that you had, or
Yeah,
was it
this
after
was
that?
much early on. So this is let me see if I can get this right. In 1979, for the next 10 years or so, I was involved in that business. All right.
Mm,
After the first 3-4 months, there were first of all there were 5 partners. There were 2 senior partners that were already in their late 60s and 70s, and then 3 junior partners, 2 colleagues of mine that had been partners before me, and then of course I became a junior partner as well. So one of the junior partners had 1, 2, 3 children that were interested in karate. And at
mm,
that time, the real estate that was on the city block that we owned was not fully occupied. A large portion of the square footage was an ex. Let's see, I can't remember. Are there Safeway stores in the Southwest?
yes, there are, or
And
there
then you
were.
remember the old design that was almost a Japanese, that swooping roof line.
Yes, yeah.
So we had one. We ended up. I ended up being a partner in that real estate business as well, and we had a full running retail drugstore in the greater space of that ex Safeway space. But there were other spaces attached to it where eventually they were filled with a fast food Chinese restaurant, a small neighborhood grocery store, and then also a black beauty products store. Okay. So at the time that I started in that 3 month period and then getting into like month 4, month 5, these kids were really pestering their father, one of my junior partners, that they wanted karate lessons. So I said, well, you know what? Let's just clear off some of the space that's not occupied. And then after work, I'll give them lessons if you can get them to the store. So that's how I started karate again in Denver. Then from there, I went to a athletic club in Aurora, which is a suburb, and then that kind of snowballed. So by the end of the 80s, I had probably 5 or 6 satellite locations, and then was working a full-time job out at the airport. And also at that time, I was heavily into officiating, and then that's when I started traveling pretty extensively, and then getting WCAF certification,
Mhm.
the Pan American certification, and all of that. So that from 1980 to 1990, primarily in the drugstore. Then the years early 90s, Candace goes to graduate school in Flagstaff, Arizona. So at that time, I had sold out my share in the drugstore, and then I was doing a lot of odd jobs, maintaining our home in Denver. And then she was in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I probably got those years wrong, but she spent almost 3 full years at Flagstaff, Arizona, getting a master's degree in physical therapy. And then she trained several times with Koyama Sensei at the summer camps and stuff that they had on the NAU campus down there. So I had all these satellite locations, working the drugstore, and then not working the drugstore, started working out at the airport. And then near the end of that time period, we wanted to start a family. So she'd give me a call and they tell me, "Hey Gary, I'm ovulating. You better get." So
It's time.
it's time. So well, prior to that too, see, I completed the divorce with my other wife, first wife. I'm now partners with my ex stepfather. I'm now remarried to Candace, and then the trip down to Flagstaff used to take me about 11 hours, which is pretty fast.
Mhm.
But at the time, I was driving Alfa Romeos, and I'd be going over 100 something miles an hour going through the reservation and stuff like that, So get to Flagstaff, 11 hours. And then I started thinking, well, it's only 6 more hours to Los Angeles. I could train with Yamazaki Sensei. So I started making that round trip, Flagstaff, Arizona, Anaheim, back to Flagstaff, back to Denver, twice a month. And that's how I continued to train with Yamazaki Sensei. And then in the meantime, those summers were occurring in between all the years. And then I'd be back in Denver. I'd be training with Yaguchi Sensei, and then continued, teaching and all that kind of stuff. So it got really, really hectic, to say the least. So what happened in 2005 is when I had my accident. And that was just kind of, I don't know if it was, I use the word God. I'm Buddhist, but I use the word God. I don't know if he wanted to just send me a message and give me a good kick in the pants and say, hey, you're just overextended. You're doing too much. So that's when I had the car accident.
And that was pretty brutal, I understand.
Yeah, I don't know whether folks know that the DIA, Denver International Airport, and I'm sure this is true with other airports in other states, in order to have a business out at DIA, regardless of what the business is, I was working for a concessions company. So, they would sell gum and all the traveler necessities, magazines, potato chips, all that kind of stuff. The company and other companies as well has to go into a contract with the city and county of Denver to ensure, even in bad weather, even to the degree that if the airlines cancel flights, they have to still maintain operating their business to take care of the travelers that are stranded out at the airport. Well, in 1981 or 83, I can't remember what it was, we had a major snowstorm here in Denver, and it was one of the few times DIA ever shut down. They canceled flights. And what I was doing was, and it was on a Sunday, I was running our employees back and forth from their house to DIA because the public transportation was shut down too. Buses weren't running. The city was pretty much at a standstill. And on the last trip out to the airport where I dropped off some employees, I was heading back home, and then I was on Pena Boulevard, which is a major highway from DIA into Denver. I'm traveling in the left lane, and it's literally bumper to bumper, and we're only going 35, 40 miles an hour. But I hit something, and I ended up going into a spin, and I stayed in my lane, and I kept spinning, and finally ended up stopping, and I thought, oh, hey, this is okay. Nothing's going to happen. And I looked to my left, and I was perpendicular in the left lane.
T-boned, huh?
Yeah. So this pickup, I don't know whether it was a Ford 150 or what, it was a quarter ton or heavier, ended up T-boning me on the left-hand side. And then, I braced myself. I felt it. And then I thought, oh, God damn, I got a couple broken ribs. That's what I thought. And then they had to cut me out of the car. And I later found out that it went out as a traveler's alert that there was a fatality out on the highway. The people at the airport thought I died. And then ended up going to emergency, and then that's where the whole thing started. That Candace ended up going to the emergency, and then because of her training and stuff, they had to give me a tracheotomy to facilitate my breathing and stuff. So she watched them cut here and insert the stuff. So because she never seen the procedure out. She's done all this stuff in anatomy class and all this stuff. She'd never seen that procedure, so she watched that, and then they had trouble stabilizing my breathing. Let's say the right lung collapsed, left lung collapsed. I had a fractured left clavicle, fractured left scapula. That's a big bone on the back. And apparently that's a really rare fracture because the bone is really thick. But that fractured. Then I had 5 pelvic fractures. But I was really lucky because I didn't require any surgery, no brain damage or anything like that. Or so I think anyway. My wife will tell you differently.
Problem. How long was that recovery? How long did it take you to get through that?
The recovery took a month. So I was in the hospital for a month, and then ended up getting out of the hospital. And then, so we're now in 2006, and then all the programs that I was running, all the senior people that I'd been training and stuff, they just stepped up, and at that time I had already I'd gotten rid of maybe 3 or 4 of the locations, so there were still 2 locations that were still active, and they were with the Colorado Athletic Club. So I had 2 of their major locations. They're one of the bigger professional athletic clubs here in Denver. I maintained operation of those 2, and they didn't even know that I had an accident because the program just went like clockwork. And then in 2006, because I was really limited in terms of my mobility, that was actually the first time I started a, quote, commercial dojo. And that's currently where I am right now. So I've been at that location since 2006.
So did that accident change you and made you a nicer teacher, or were you still mean and everything?
I hope so. I always say, I hope I'm the person my dog thinks I am.
That's probably not though.
Yeah, I have to admit, there's certain things that have just plagued me over the years and stuff. And one is I have a really bad temper, and that's something that I've always it's been a constant battle control that and stuff like that. And I think I've gotten a little better over the years, but that happened. And then
I
I've
think
always
all of
had
us have bad tempers. I think all karate
yeah,
teachers do.
but do you throw things or did you throw things?
No, I don't. Only
Yeah,
people.
I threw things. So I got that
Shurikens.
other yeah, and then
Oh, that's too funny.
I've always been I hope this doesn't sound so self-ingratiating, but I think I've been pretty successful in appreciating my life because I've just been so lucky.
Yeah.
Not only recovering from the accident, but just all the people that I've met and all the support that I've gotten over the years. And, I think all the way back to my childhood, growing up in the neighborhood. The neighborhood I grew up in was heavily concentrated Japanese businesses and stuff like that. And I know that the group of kids that I hung around with, I know that we just terrorized the merchants and stuff. But I think back and I just thank them for all the people that were alive at the time. Their tolerance and their guidance. I think, my God, we were so lucky, and that feeling of appreciation, of course, was amplified by the accident. And one of the things that happened was, and I think I've told you before, sometimes even now, and when shortly after the accident, it was really difficult for me. I would just start crying.
Mhm.
I'd hear a song, I'd think of a particular experience, or I'd see it snowing or raining, and I couldn't control this crying. And
Mhm.
to some degree, I got that under control now, but still, and apparently that's not an unusual reaction to a really traumatic experience, from what I've been told. So
I absolutely believe that in my heart and soul. That to start wrapping up the show a little bit, I wanted to ask you a couple final questions. One, what do you think of today's traditional karate compared to those days? Do you feel we're on the right path? Have we lost our way? What's your idea, perceptions on that? Pretty deep.
that's a tough one.
I know it is. It is.
Okay. Well, you know me well enough to know that I will enthusiastically support the old way of training, simply
Right.
because there are just so much of the philosophy and the customs and the respect, just as a total system in terms of making one's life better, as well as
Mm,
other people that you come into contact with. The respect thing in particular, I don't presume to think that other sports don't teach it. But I think in the total system of Karate Do that it takes on not only a cultural aspect, but this whole martial art history that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, and being a soldier, that kind of attitude, I think is, I don't want to say it's lost, but I don't think it's being taught with as much emphasis as it used to be. And I'm sure you've heard other instructors complain about the current generation of kids. They just don't have that fire in their gut. I can remember when I started, even as an adult, to show just a simple technique, it would be like, wow, that's really cool. And then you'd practice it for hours and hours and hours. And then you start thinking, I can hardly wait to open a dojo. I've yet to hear that from anybody that I've trained. I can hardly wait to open my own dojo. I haven't heard that. And to me, that's sad. I think it's a good thing that all these younger kids are sharing their experiences and sharing training time and working with each other and going to different instructors and stuff like that. But I think in the process, there are certain things that have been neglected and that are not being taught in the same way. So
It's funny that you mentioned about the opening schools. Since I opened my school under Sensei Marlon, there's not been one person open a traditional school here in Arizona in the
oh,
last
wow.
40 years. And it's really makes me sad because I see a lot of eclectic schools everywhere, but I'm with you on the tradition. I think it's waning a little bit. I still think there are many schools like your school and our school that are still traditional and a few others, but yeah, I'm concerned. The other question I wanted to ask you is about competition. How do you compare today's competition and training compared to back in your day? Has it changed at all?
Well, in my day, I think we just trained as idiots.
We are good
You
at it.
know, since they tell you to do something, you just say height, and you just went ahead and did it. You say, okay, you're going to train 8 hours today. And hey, we didn't question it. You say height, and then say after 8 hours is done, he says, hey, you want me to do anything else, Sensei? The technical perspective was absent. I mean, it was starting.
Yeah,
People were talking about nutrition. People were starting to talk about weight training. People were talking about how weight training, what kind of weight training you do, all
right,
those things.
right,
But that was all that kind of talk was just beginning then.
right.
Now the athletes are much smarter.
They are.
They can train fewer hours and be as productive as I was, and I trained 6 to 8 hours a day every day,
Mhm.
and even on Sundays. I didn't take that day off to recuperate or anything like that. So, and you know, uh, I have to be honest, I didn't train 4 years that way, the way Olympians are training now. I only did it for 9 months, but it was quite different, quite different. And I was just tired all the time, and in terms of appreciating the support and stuff that I got, I think it would have been really difficult if I had not been teaching at the time, because I would go to class and then I would get one of the senior students and I say, "Yeah, I got to go out for a little run. You want to run with me?" And then, they take turns running with me. And, I want to do a little bit of extra training in between classes. And I say, can you stay a little bit longer? I need to work on something to help me with that. And got a lot of support that way. And Yamazaki Sensei was more than supportive. And, I would do my training, my individual training prior to my 11 o'clock class, midday classes at the university. I taught 2 karate classes. So I would start at 4 in the morning, and then that's my morning workout. Then after the 11 to 11, 12 to 1 class, take a short nap in the afternoon, and I start weight training, a little bit of weight training. Then I'd go to the main dojo, which was 40 minutes away in Anaheim, and then I'd assist with some of the teaching there. And then at 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock, Sensei and I would stay another hour, hour and a half, and he'd work with me on kata. So that was a routine day after day. And I can remember one time driving back from Anaheim, and then my first wife at the time had made some kind of a stew or something. And I sat down and I ended up just falling asleep with my head in the bowl. I was just so tired. I was just tired all the time. But I'm happy that the science has evolved, and the younger athletes right now have access to that, and then they can attain the level that they need to. But one of the positive things about the old way of training and that is training your mind and your spirit. And I don't know, I'm not in it the way they are now. So
Right.
I don't know if their mind and their spirit is evolving as much as their physical skills are, given the knowledge that they have access to right now. So,
Yeah, the thing that I see, I love the current athletes. They are in better condition, they're serious, they train hard. Unfortunately, what I've seen is when they get past their competition career as it ends, then they quit martial arts. And I'm
yeah.
thinking, well, there's that soul or spirit that you're talking that they don't have. Final question. What is your current mission today? What's your current martial art mission today as you go off into the sunset of life with the rest of us?
uh, I don't
Eh,
know.
That's a deep question.
Yeah. There's a movie, and I can't even remember the name of it. I can remember the scene, but the main character, what he says is he wants to graduate life with honors. That's my goal. I want to graduate
Yeah.
life with honors. And what that means is that hopefully I'll have achieved my personal goals, but also I hope that the people I've come into contact with will remember me in a good way. There's a saying that says that people may not remember what you say, and people may, in fact, not even remember what you do, but you can bet for sure they're going to remember how you made them feel. And I hope that when I die, that people will think about me from time to time, and I hope their words are kind and their thoughts are kind. That's all my mission is.
Well, in that case, I'm doomed. I'm doomed.
You, my friend, need to be kinder to yourself.
I know. Sensei, thank you for the honor for you being a guest on my show. My mission in this last chapter of my life, and I can't believe I'm there, is to get stories like yourselves out into the public, especially for the young people coming up to get a chance to know, what some of the older people have done, because it's easy to forget history.
Yeah,
And that's very good. So thank you, Sensei, from the bottom of my heart.
I appreciate it. I appreciate your friendship. Let's keep in touch.
Absolutely. Hey, well, thank you for joining the show. My next guest is Sensei Bill Damon out of Tucson, Arizona. He started his training in the mid 60s and had an excellent martial art career. So that'll be our next guest. Until then, take care. We'll see you then.